attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Steele, and as always, I'm happy to be back for another show. Today, the guest is Chris Sarns, the man behind the new series of articles coming out addressing the question, does NIST 9/11 WTC 7 investigations equate to fraud? We'll be talking about that and other 9/11 truth-related issues, and we'll be playing the latest in C-SPAN questions. Stay tuned. You will not be disappointed. Now, like I said before, the show is 9/11 Free Fall. We talk about 9/11 truth. We bring focus to the science of 9/11 truth, and I bring you guests who are out there sounding the alarm about the fact that the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7 were destroyed in a pre-planned controlled demolition on 9/11. This is a fact that undermines all the efforts of our government and corporate media to reshape our society and the societies of other nations and impose the policies of the post-9/11 world on the regular folks like you and me. Because the lie is so obvious and the stakes are so high, the entities tasked with covering up the reality of what 9/11 was are doing what they can to keep a lid on the growing movement that exposes it. 9/11 truth activists are pacifist soldiers in a guerrilla war, striking whenever they can, even when it means breaking the poisoned slumber that some hide in to avoid facing the truth. We insert the reality of the scientific evidence in the middle of the phony, meaningless chit-chat about wedge issues that our media promotes, and we break up the pompous public flattery sessions of our so-called representatives by demanding that they actually do their job and address the evidence. The reality is, folks, in the post-9/11 world, we are all we have. We are an occupied nation, occupied by ignorance and by an establishment of media and government that has no interest in doing what's right, but in obfuscating and in hurting the populace towards the latest agenda. Now, the group leading the way in the fight when it comes to the science and hard evidence is Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Folks, if you haven't heard of this group yet, you need to go to ae911truth.org right now. This is an organization representing almost 2,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers on 9/11. The evidence that ae911 Truth brings to the table proves the buildings were brought down in a controlled demolition on 9/11. And you can see that evidence outlined in the movies Blueprint for Truth and 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. Or if you only got a few minutes to find out why everything you thought you knew about 9/11 is wrong, you can also check out Solving the Mystery of Building 7. This is the short movie in which Ed Asner introduces you to the basic evidence. And once you're awake and filled with the desire to wake others up, you got to click the volunteer tab on the right-hand side of the screen and let ae911 Truth know that you're ready to join the team. And folks, whatever you can contribute in the way of time or effort or ideas is needed in this important battle. So don't just sit there and wait for someone else to do it. You know you're needed, so step up and speak out. All right, that's ae911truth.org. Go there right now. Okay, this week in C-SPAN, we got quite a few clips here to play, and I guess we'll start off with this one. Greg from Kansas City, this is from a few weeks ago, he gets a lot of the question in, but at the helm that day is Old Man Slen. That's Peter Slen. And Peter Slen's been kind of like a troll on a bridge with this topic of 9/11 truth. He don't like 9/11 truth, he don't want to hear it, and he's not going to let what really killed 3,000 people interfere with his chit-chat about current events, so he's going to cut Greg off. Not that the IRS thing that they're talking about isn't important, but as, of course, the caller states, nobody has died from that. So here you go. The congressman is Bob Goodlatte. So let's listen in.
We have about 25 minutes before the House comes in. Our guest is Bob Goodlatte, chair of the House Judiciary Committee, a Republican of Virginia, and Greg is a Republican in Kansas City, Missouri. Greg, you're on the air.
Morning.
Hi.
Good morning. You've called for an investigation into the IRS scandal. And as bad as that scandal is, nobody has died from it. But people did die on 9/11, and countless members of Congress have been delivered a peer-reviewed paper proving the existence of explosive nanothermite residue in the World Trade Center dust.
Greg,
Why is it still
we got the point, but when it comes to the IRS issue, have you called for an investigation?
We certainly have. In fact, just yesterday, the
Okay, so we're grading these politicians on their responses, and normally I give D's when the host cuts off the caller and doesn't give the target of the question a chance to hear or answer it, but Greg got enough of the question through so that the congressman knew what it was about, and he looks happy to be relieved of addressing it by Slynn, so I'm going to give him a big fat F for lack of effort. Now, if you remember Congressman Higgins, when he was asked a question about this by John Meters a few weeks ago, John was cut off, but he still answered the question. So there's no reason that this Bob Goodlake can't do the same. Now, this next one is Congressman Delaney from New York. Christine from New Jersey actually managed to get her whole question out. And props to Greta, the host, for not panicking and cutting the feed when she mentions Building 7. But listen to the congressman's answer, though.
Viewers can ask about that as well. So let's get to them. Christine in New Jersey, Democratic caller. Christine, what's the name of your town?
Lake Apacon, New Jersey.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Good morning. Well, I wanted to ask, in light of the current distrust of the government and with all the scandals going on, don't you think it would be a good idea to get to the bottom of people's concerns about what really happened on 9/11 with Building 7, with over 1,900 architects and engineers disputing the official story?
Are you talking about 9/11, 2001?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's like 1,900 architects and engineers disputing the official story because it's, needs to be investigated further.
And Christine, where do you read about this? Where are you getting this information?
It's all over the place, and lots of people are talking. I don't hear it in the mainstream media, but I hear it online. There's lots of people talking about it.
Okay. All right. John Delaney.
So Christine, obviously 9/11 was a tragic, terrible day for our country. It's a day that we all remember with sorrow for all of those people who lost their lives, and it was a real turning point in many ways for our country, both domestically and internationally. And it'll remain an emotional day, I believe, for all Americans. For our generation, it will be like Pearl Harbor was for the generation before. So I think there'll always be a lot of discussion and dialogue about what happened and how it was handled, and even the memorial that's been built on the site, which I've seen. I was actually there only last week. I've been there several times, but I was in New York a few weeks ago and went to the memorial. Even that's still a highly charged, emotional discussion about whether the memorial should have been built there or not. Was it the appropriate memorial, et cetera? So I think we're going to be living for some time with a lot of emotions around 9/11, the terrible tragedy where we lost so many Americans, and discussions about it. And I think it'll just be part of the dialogue around that very significant day.
On our line for Republicans, David.
Okay, and I don't really know what that was, what we just heard. It's like one of those copy and paste letters that these congressmen send to you in the mail when you write to them. It's a total smokescreen that he put up, completely avoiding the question, just knows he has to say something, throws the word emotion in there, the word Pearl Harbor in there, kind of just spits out that answer. So big F for Delaney. Now, our next one, the following week, there was no congressman on. I think they were in recess because of the holiday. However, there was a episode in which they were talking about the media, and during the open line session, Libby Casey was the host that day. She was asking the viewer, where do you get your source of news? And a lot of people have been calling in, flattering Washington Journal for their so-called unbiased coverage. So I felt compelled to call in and set the record straight as I see it. So this was the 2 Wednesdays ago.
Wish you could. So Anna keeps paper copies around. Andy, what about you? Vernon, New York, Republican. How do you get your news? What do you hang on to?
Well, I hang on to my own common sense, and I have to go to the internet. I watch Washington Journal every morning, but I disagree that it's the above slanted coverage. I noticed that the hosts on this show impose their own biases on what gets discussed. For instance, even though 1,900 architects and engineers who know why buildings fall down and why they don't have questioned the official story of what happened to the buildings in New York, I watched numerous instances in which C-SPAN has decided for the viewers what they think is reasonable discourse by treating people who ask our representatives these questions very rudely, cutting them off, completely unprofessional, and really uninformed about this topic.
So, Andy, where do you get your news? Where do you go to?
Where do I go? I go to Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. AE911truth.org will tell you why the buildings really fell down.
Okay, let's go to Gilbert.
Okay. Later that day, there was a person named Olivier Knox. He's a White House correspondent. He's now working with Yahoo News, which I guess is a big deal in the journalism world. And he's going to be their White House correspondent. And Sabra from North Carolina got through and asked this following question.
A news platform on their smartphones, for example. But I completely agree. Like the credibility thing is absolutely crucial.
Let's go to the phones and hear from Sabra, Asheville, North Carolina, Democrats line. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
I'd like to know how we can stop the black hole phenomenon where certain news stories are followed, like political gossip stories or scandal stories, and other stories simply get ignored for years or decades. As an example, 15 or 20 years ago, climate change would have caused nothing but rolling of eyes and a diversionary answer. And nowadays, if someone mentions the presence of nanothermite in the dust at the World Trade Center, it's enough to stop the conversation short. And where there should be inquiry and looking for whether yes or no these things are true, political reporters or other reporters simply don't follow up on things that have not already been followed by the mass pack in the press.
Well, I think climate change is, first of all, it's a very important story, and I think we do cover it both on a science perspective and a political perspective. There's no doubt that it could stand to get a lot more coverage. In terms of things, disappearing off the radar, there certainly is an element of the media following the day's story, sometimes to the detriment of longer term stories like that. So I think the caller is broadly correct that we need to be more careful about the kinds of long term stories that we follow.
Olivier Knox, we saw recently.
So Olivier doesn't address the nanothermite. He focuses instead on everything else in the question. Typical dodge. And these people who actually get to sit at the White House and ask the president questions are more concerned with their career and their status in journalism. They're not going to address something as big as that. Now, in other news, and this is from a few weeks ago, 3 federal appeals court judges ruled that the White House doesn't have to release the alleged photos of somebody who is allegedly Osama bin Laden, who the White House claims was killed by SEALs on May 1st, 2011. And we don't get too deep into this topic on the show because we keep this show focused on 9/11 itself, but it's related and we've touched on it before. So we're going to touch on it now, but the article I'm looking at is from Reuters, and Judicial Watch sued for the photographs and video of the body to be released, citing the Freedom of Information Act, but the White House was shielded from having to prove that bin Laden was really killed in 2011. And like I said on the show before, folks, they released the photos of the other guys killed in the raid, just not the guy they said was bin Laden. They did release a video supposedly taken from a building of a guy watching bin Laden on TV at an earlier time, who they said was bin Laden watching himself on TV. Despite the fact, though, his cheekbones and ears are different, and despite that he was identified by a neighbor as being someone else entirely. So I asked this, what's so hard about releasing the photos? Obama says we're not a country that does that. Are you kidding me? Yes, we are. Oh, yeah. I mean, suddenly he finds humanity when it's convenient. Give me a break. At this point, the American people have no way of confirming of whether or not they really killed bin Laden in 2011, or if they killed somebody else, and the SEALs were told that. So that's why we have to see that. And at this point, even if the court ruled the White House had to release the photos or the videos, it wouldn't really mean anything. I mean, the same establishment brought down the towers. I think they can manage Photoshop. In other news, and this is very good, World Trade Center 7 comes to 3 million more PBS TV viewers. And this article is actually written by our guest today. AE 9/11 Truth is proud to air once again the fascinating 5-minute excerpt of architects and engineers solving the mystery of World Trade Center 7. And this is going to be on PBS stations nationwide. And they calculate that to be about 3 million people watching PBS. And of course, in the movie, as I mentioned earlier in the show, it's award-winning actor Ed Asner provides an intriguing narration to solving the mystery of World Trade Center 7 that eases viewers into the astonishing evidence surrounding the skyscraper's destruction on 9/11. And it introduces viewers to the quote-unquote collapse of World Trade Center 7 on 9/11, and it includes expert testimony of technical and building professionals. So the shortened version of this YouTube hit will fill in between 55-minute PBS programs like Frontline, Masterpiece Theater, and the News Hour. And people watch Masterpiece Theater. My mom watches it all the time. So this is great news. And don't just sit silent, folks. Okay, write to PBS. Thank them for airing it and ask them to air other documentaries by AE 9/11 Truth also. You know, they're taking a big, bold step in putting these programs on, so they need to know that you appreciate them. Okay, before we get to our guests, we're going to do what we do most weeks. We're going to take about 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. So we're going to do that right now. Okay, and that is 10 seconds. All right, our guest today is Chris Sarns. Chris is a retired remodel contractor. He is a researcher with AE 9/11 Truth, and he's the author of a new series of articles that argues that NIST's official 9/11 investigations on Building 7 constitute fraud. And he was responsible, in a large part, for bringing Building 7 to the forefront of AE 9/11 Truth's discussion about 9/11 and the argument. So he's going to be telling us more about that. Chris, welcome to 9/11 Free Fall.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for having me.
Now, Chris, let's talk about yourself to start this off and your own realization of this crime. How did you wake up to the 9/11 Truth evidence, and what made you to decide to take action?
Well, like most people, I bought the official conspiracy theory hook, line, and sinker, and I was all, let's go get them. I should know better, because I voted for Bobby Kennedy, and 3 hours later he was dead. And I've long known that was a conspiracy, as was the Kennedy assassination and the Martin Luther King assassinations. But I still couldn't believe that my government would murder 3,000 of their own citizens. So I went along with it until 2005. I saw, it was channel surfing, and I came across a, quote, conspiracy program, and I decided to watch. And shortly after I started watching, they had a video of Building 7 coming down. And it's the one with the red building in front. And by the time that building went out of sight, I knew it was a controlled demolition. I mean, this is an easy one. You don't have to be any kind of an expert to see that that's a controlled demolition. It couldn't be anything else. And that's when I had my oh shit moment. I realized in about a second that yes, that's a controlled demolition. It takes weeks to rig a building. Oh my God. They had to have known that the towers were coming down, or they couldn't have done this. So the whole thing is a lie. And it took a while for that to really sink in. It took me several months before I realized that I had to do something. And I finally got active. I was just kind of a neophyte on the web. I didn't know much about the web. I used it for shopping a little bit, never used it for news. So I went on the web and just Googled World Trade Center Building 7 and came up with WTC7.net, which is still probably the best starting point for anybody new to the situation. And so I went from there, found Loose Change, and went to the Loose Change Forum. From the Loose Change Forum, Dylan actually recommended that I take my arguments over to JREF and try them out on those guys, which I did. And that turned out to be very, very fruitful. Even though it's rather painful arguing with those guys, they have access to all the information, all the photographs, all the documents, everything. So by arguing with them, and they keep coming up with the documents to prove their point, and I keep going and reading the documents a little further and realizing they're BSing me, that actually the document they sent me or the photograph they sent me actually proves controlled demolition. One very cute thing I always get a kick out of, Gravy, which is Mark Roberts, one of the lead guys over there, kept demanding that I read the NIST Appendix L 2004 report. And I told him, hey, I have dial-up. There's no way I can download the whole thing. So he sent me the URL for the NIST Appendix L 2004 progress report. which is only 52 pages. It took like 15, 20 minutes to download it on dial-up. But I was able to go through it, and the first thing I found was it says it doesn't prove. They were claiming that it proved Building 7 came down by fire, and it actually said supposedly, or words to that effect. I can't remember their exact words. But through arguing with those guys, I learned a great deal and got a lot of information. It was very, very, very fruitful. I learned from an argument with R. Mackey that I was reading the Appendix L report, and on page 18, where it talks about that huge gash in the south wall that they were claiming had a lot to do with the collapse, on the same page, there was a quote by firemen saying, when they left, there was dust in the lobby and wires hanging down, but no heavy debris. Well, I figured the lobby's got to be on that front side, and I checked it out and looked. Yeah, sure enough. Well, if that 10-story gash in the middle, 1/3 the width and 1/4 the depth, would have left a huge pile of debris in the lobby on the first floor. I mean, it would have been the piece that hit the building, and the entire front wall would have been piled up there. And so, well, wait a minute. We have a conflict right here on the same page. And I went further, and but it was because I was arguing with Mackey that I kept going back and reading that, and I finally noticed, hey, there's something wrong here. So eventually I found 4 different quotes that conflicted with the 10-story gouge, and I argued the point with them. I started a thread called the 10-story hole that went 50,000 posts and went over 2 years. Of course, we got into a lot of other things. Also, I learned just by arguing that with them that the diesel fuel fire was a complete farce from the get-go. There were no fires reported on the 5th floor at any time. There was just supposition. Even if there was a fire, there's a photograph on page 26 of the FEMA report, the FEMA C report, I think it's a FEMA C, that shows the louvers in the generator room on the northeast corner of the 5th floor. There's no smoke. Well, if there was a fire in that room, smoke would be pouring out. And if there was a fire in the room and the louvers were close, the fire would starve and burn itself out for lack of oxygen. So just using that simple logic, I concluded that the fire that they said started the collapse never happened or couldn't possibly have done anything. And I argued with the JREFers for a long time, months on that. And I finally posted my final conclusion at both their forum and over at the Loose Shade forum. And a month later, on December 18th or 17th, 2007, NIST came out and admitted that the diesel fuel fire thing didn't happen, that it was normal office fires. And I can't help thinking I had a lot to do with that, because if nobody called them on it, they probably would have gone with their original idea, the original hypothesis of diesel fuel fires and debris damage, both of which I proved to be wrong. And those will be brought up in the 5 different segments that you were talking about earlier. The first one was the fire. There was no fire in the diesel room, diesel generator room on the 5th floor. That was a complete fraud, and they knew it. They had the information that there was no fire reported, and even if there was, it couldn't possibly have had anything to do with the collapse. But I learned all this stuff just by arguing with those guys over at JREF. So in a way, they've been very useful. So anyway, that's how I got into it, and how I got most of my information.
Right, and you've done a great service by debunking the diesel thing. I remember when I first started. Now, I'm not an engineer or an architect, and I was basically just using my own common sense, and I was also, in a way, infiltrating the other side by posing as a debunker back when I was still in a research phase, and I would talk to these people and I'd ask them questions either about the building collapses or other elements of 9/11, pretending that I'm in an argument with the truther and asking them and saying, well, what if he says this? So that they're not immediately hostile, and they couldn't really answer these things even on a friendly basis. So that's when I knew there was a problem with the other side. But a lot of times I'd have this diesel thing cited to me, and people would say it with such confidence, and it's almost a disservice to anybody who would put out that kind of judgment without studying it. Now, this isn't World Trade Center 7, but it was Bezant who put out about the Twin Towers within a few days of paper, claiming that he had already, offering some kind of theory on it. And it was really irresponsible to put these things out because it laid a foundation that there was some kind of authoritative explanation for why these buildings fell right from the start that people cited, and they would say it confidently, but then later they'd be debunked, and then the system, the agencies tasked with investigating these destructions would just slide over into some new kind of explanation, and people, many of which would just kind of stick to the old explanation and it would not even, but even the people who support him would just slide over into the new explanation too. And so it's just this constantly changing story that people have this unfounded confidence in, and it never stays the same. So you did a tremendous service by doing that. And also too, we mentioned earlier, you were at the forefront of bringing Building 7 to being a major discussion point for architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. You want to discuss that?
Okay. When I first joined, the night that they videotaped Blueprint for Truth over in San Rafael, I went because I live in Placerville, which is like maybe 2.5 hours away, and that was close enough I could make it. And I had joined AA 9/11 Truth in July of 2007, I think. Yeah. When I found out that you didn't have to be an engineer, I joined as another. And then a year later, they put up a notice that they were going to be doing shooting a video. And so I went, and that's the night I met Richard. And it was very interesting because I sat down, and I had been in communication with Judy Shelton. Judy Shelton was like the secretary, more or less, of AE 9/11 Truth at the time. And I sat down right next to her and got a chance to meet her and talk to her. And I also met Jim Hoffman. He was there. And a few other people. But afterward, Richard is a very gregarious guy. He said, anybody want to go out for beers afterward? Can join me. So we all went out, and of course, most everyone had non-alcoholic drinks. I had a Cuba Libre. I think I was the only person that had an alcoholic drink. But anyway, I got a chance to talk to Richard, and I was telling him about how I was arguing with the J-Reffers and Mark Roberts in particular. And he was telling me that he had a debate coming up with Mark Roberts, and I told him I would love to coach him because I knew Mark Roberts' tactics, and I could help him, with the question, the statements I knew would come from Mark Roberts and the BS that would come out of his mouth. That still is around. It didn't work out very well. Mark Roberts was able to run his thing, as they always do. It starts off nice, and then they start interrupting, and then they start insulting. And they talk. It happened every time we had a debate, right from that first one with Mark Roberts to the last one on 9/11 last year, or 2011. They start off nice, and then they get nasty, and they talk about 6 things at once. So there's no way you can possibly cover what they've said. And they throw in a lot of BS and a lot of blatantly false statements and just outright lies. So it's really impossible to debate these guys on the air unless you had a very strict set of rules that you can only talk about one thing at a time. You may not insult the other person, but they always agree to those rules and they break them every time. So dealing with these people, I think debating them is really counterproductive. We thought it would be a good idea for a while, but it's never turned out well. But anyway, that's how I got started with 8911 Truth, is I went to the filming of Blueprint for Truth, joined the team as Richard's coach for that first debate, and then I spent a lot of time over at Richard's house editing. It was like 2 hours and 18 minutes to begin with. We had to edit it down to 2 hours, then edit it down to 1 hour, then edit it down to 30 minutes, and then edit it down to 10 minutes, was just the Building 7 part. And what we would do, Richard would throw basically pizza parties, where he'd order like a half a dozen pizzas and have 20 people come over. And we would watch the video and take notes as to what we could cut out. And this would happen, I don't know, maybe once a month for, 6 months. And by the time we got to the very end, when we were doing the 10-minute version, it had gotten down to just Richard, Ken Jenkins, and myself on the very last night of editing the Building 7 part. And it wound up, I did the final edits and finished about 4 o'clock in the morning, which was typical. And that's with the 10-minute version. But so that was kind of my introduction. I was always pushing Building 7 because that's what got me involved in the first place. And to me, that video is a whole thing. I mean, anybody with a functioning brain looking at that video can see that it's a controlled demolition. And just getting that video in front of people, I think, is really going to be the coup de grace that finally turns this thing.
I agree with you. And you know, it's funny, you were woken up by Building 7, and when you realized that they couldn't have set this up in a morning with the Twin Towers event happening next door, the whole thing unravels. This is why we focus so much on the building destructions, and in particular Building 7 on this show, because it is the gateway. It is the key to opening people's minds on all sorts of topics. Just a quick anecdote, when I was first starting off and I would debate with a certain guy that I had known on the internet, every time we got to Building 7, he would always write it off with, well, that's probably just something we don't need to know about. And of course, you can't do that. You don't get a free pass. You don't have a card you can just throw out. You skip, skip go or skip the go to jail box on the Monopoly board, where you just get to overlook a giant building, a 47-story high-rise collapsing for no apparent reason, other than some scattered fires. That it's never happened to a steel frame high-rise like that before or after that day. You can't just overlook that and say that's just something we don't need to know about. Go back to sleep. So this is the sticking point. You're absolutely right, and 8911 Truth is absolutely correct in making that a big point in their arguments, and it manages to open up a lot of eyes. All right, I know you have a lot to talk about on this subject, so I want to give you a chance to do it. And the reason that we're focusing on this today is because there's debate even among scientists and scholars who are calling for a new investigation into 9/11 of whether or not the NIST reports constitute fraud. So before we go into details on this, as an overall picture, Chris, how would you describe the NIST report on Building 7?
A magnificent piece of obfuscation and bullshit.
All right. Well, that does paint a good picture. So let's go into a little bit more detail. What would be the most glaring obfuscation that you would see? Okay.
Well, let's start off with my 5 points that are going to be the first one was already posted at AE 911 column, and the fact that the fire that supposedly started the collapse, if you look at the photographs, it had burned an hour and a half before the collapse. I leave it as more than, over an hour just to be safe. But you can see, just using the quotes from the NIST report, where they talk about how the fire spread from office to office by burning over the top and through the ceiling of the office next door. Then there's also a quote that says they didn't know what the fire load was in each office, obviously, so they had to assign the same fuel load uniformly across all the offices. Well, if the fuel load is uniform, then the fire would spread uniformly. Yet their model has the fire burning up to column 79, the offices around column 79, and for no reason whatsoever, it doesn't jump and burn the offices to the southwest of column 79. It burns around the east side, up to the corner, all the way around column 79, and then 2 hours later, it's burning the offices to the southwest of column 79. Well, in the real world, that's not possible because the fire would spread equally in all directions and would have burned from the south side to the north side in a line or perhaps an arc. And the way it hit the north wall, it was obviously an arc because it hit at one window about 80 feet from the corner and then spread very rapidly in both directions. Well, that's a wall of fire coming to the north wall from the south because it spread faster than you could actually spread from office to office. It was coming across the hallway in an arc, and it hit right at column 44 first and then spread in both directions. Within, I think, 5 or 10 minutes, within 15 minutes, it had spread all the way to the northeast corner. And that was the last part of the northeast section to be burning. Well, they also note that the fires only burned for a half an hour in any one location. By 3:20, or even before that, even by about 3:15, the northeast corner was burning. So by 3:45, that entire section where the collapse supposedly occurred had burned out, and the fire was burning over toward the west end. And that's all laid out in detail with photographs and quotes from the NIST report. It's now down a little ways, but it's still on the front page of AE 9/11 Truth. I think it's about the third or fourth article down now. But it's there, and you can read it. It's also at Truth Phalanx, a page that John Ferrulis put together, a website, and that's where everything was posted and is still posted. And that's how Richard found out about it. We were just discussing it. And I said, Richard, have you seen this yet? We went over there and started looking at it. And originally, Richard didn't realize that all the quotes were from the NIST reports. And once he realized that, he went, oh, my God, we got to get this on AE. So he and I went over the whole thing and changed it and altered it to fit his liking so it made sense to him. And we made a lot of changes and I think improved it a great deal. So I really appreciate Richard's help on that. We spent a lot of time on it. And then since then, I've spent even more time going back and correcting and adding all kinds of things. But basically, the fire that supposedly started the collapse had burned out in the area of the collapse an hour and a half before the collapse. So it could not have possibly have caused the collapse. It's, their whole hypothesis dies right there.
Amazing. And I just want to tell the listener that if you go to ae911truth.org and look at Chris's article, he's got the pictures and the thermal images and all of that, because I understand listening, people may, their minds might be trying to map the movement of this fire that you're describing, but you can go to ae911truth.org and see it for yourself with all the illustrations that are there. So you have the fire movement here and the fact that it was burned out. Now, how do you, and because the reason I'm asking this is that I know that our listeners may ask this, even people, again, people who question the official story of the building destructions will ask this, is how do we know that this is fraud and not just a tremendous ignorance from NIST?
Well, it would be awfully hard to be that stupid. But David Cole, a researcher for 9/11 Truth, who has recently joined the AE team, found an absolute indisputable fraud. This is also will come up later on in my 5-part series. But he looked at the erection drawings that were released in a FOIA request in the beginning of 2011. And he went through hundreds of drawings and found the drawing that shows the girder and the seat the girder between column 79 and 44, and the seat at column 79. And in the drawings, they have flange stiffeners. Now, an I-beam is a steel beam that looks like an italicized I, with a flange on the top and a flange on the bottom, and the vertical part in the center is called the web. And that particular girder was, I believe, 30 inches high and 12 inches wide. The flanges were 12 inches, and the web was 30 inches. And it was sitting on a seat that was welded to the side of column 79. Now, the official explanation is that the floor beams heated up so much that they expanded and pushed this girder off its seat. The girder fell to the floor below, and that started a cascade of floor failures that left column 79 unbraced for 9 floors. Column 79 buckled, and that led to a progressive collapse, which, by the way, is ridiculous, that gutted the entire interior, caused all the interior columns to fail, while leaving the exterior columns pristine and not showing any sign of an interior failure. And then all of a sudden, they all give it once. Well, the whole thing is ludicrous on a lot of levels that I won't get into, but they claim that what happened is when the girder was pushed past center, when the web, the vertical part, was no longer over the seat, that the flange folded and the girder fell. Well, in the plans, as David Cole discovered, they had flange stiffeners, a piece of metal welded to the web and to the flange, designed specifically to keep the flange from folding. And they left these flange stiffeners out. There is no chance this was a mistake. This was a deliberate fraud to make their collapse theory work.
Well, David Chandler introduced the word to me, dry labbing. Where you manipulate your data so you can achieve a predetermined outcome, and that is exactly what you are describing here. It is absolutely amazing that this is allowed to go on. I mean, in your opinion, Chris, how do you think this happens? I mean, this kind of misrepresentation of the facts by a government agency, because when we say NIST, we think of it as one person, but it's actually a collective of several employees, many of which probably, it's no skin off their nose what the final outcome is. There may be even good people within it. Wouldn't you expect there to be some honest people within the agency who have no agenda and would speak out about wrong info in the investigation, especially since it involves the biggest mass murder in U.S. history?
Well, evidently not. Would you report, if you knew that your boss had just murdered 3,000 people, would you claim, hey, wait a minute, he's lying, I've got the proof here? How long do you think he would live, That's
true. I mean,
so
you're right. It's amazing. I mean, and I've said it before on the show, and I'll say it again. There's going to be volumes written on the massive cover-up, on the psychology of our modern society, and it trickles down. And I agree with you completely. And I ask these questions because people ask these questions because it just seems so enormous and the silence. But there's so many levels to it. It's people protecting their jobs. But what you describe, it is fraud. It is absolutely fraud, and this is why we wrote to the police many months back. So I wanted to have that addressed, but people need to look at this. And it's funny, Chris, you heard the responses of politicians, and we're veering off a little here, but it's good to veer off sometimes. But you heard the response of the politicians, and I imagine you saw the compilation video of other calls on C-SPAN to these politicians. They hear this evidence when it's presented. What are you thinking about from some of these responses that you hear from these politicians and pundits?
Well, they're just skating. They know that something's wrong. They kind of brush it off with standard lines that they've been given that they know about. And you have to realize that questioning 9/11 is a career ender. Anybody who questions 9/11 is run out of Washington. The media is completely controlled. So even if you did tell the truth, no one would hear it. All they would hear is that you were a nutjob conspiracy theorist, which is really kind of funny because 19 hijackers is a conspiracy theory. That's the line I usually use when people call me a conspiracy theorist or mention conspiracy theory. I just remind them that 19 hijackers is a conspiracy theory. So, but it's like the same thing. You cannot criticize Israel. Criticizing Israel is a career ender. There's just certain things you don't do. And another funny thing is, like, they're still talking about the Kennedy assassination, people who believe a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination as a lunatic fringe. Well, the lunatic fringe is now 70 to 80%. So evidently we have a 70 to 80% lunatic fringe in the United States. I love it when they compare 9/11 truthers to people who believe the Kennedys were conspiracies, because most people now realize that that's the truth. But like me, most people don't make the connection that the people who killed the Kennedys are still in charge, and they would think absolutely, they took us to war in Vietnam based on a pack of lies, 58,000 dead Americans. Bush and Cheney took us to war in Iraq based on a pack of lies, 4,000 American soldiers dead. Well, the people just can't wrap their mind around the fact that the government kills American soldiers all the time, as Kissinger said. Soldiers are just dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns, and that is how they really feel, and that is exactly what they do. But people cannot make that step from lying us into war and getting our soldiers killed based on a pack of lies to actually killing 3,000 Americans on American soil. I couldn't do it. Most people can't. But the video of Building 7 will wake up any person capable of waking up. If you can look at that and still remain asleep, then nothing will wake you up. You cannot wake a man who pretends to be asleep.
Right, and I've had people tell me, people when I mentioned this, and this is kind of what I do, they'll say, you really think that? And they'll say about themselves, I have a healthy skepticism of government, but that's just crazy. And when I point out that your response shows, pre-programming from our establishment, this mass peer pressure system, before you even look at the evidence, shows that you really don't have a healthy skepticism of government, and especially after people see the evidence and they'll agree with it, but they just don't think that it could be possible, because they just don't think it. Shows that their skepticism of government really isn't all that healthy. When you have provable scientific facts that don't just change because it's 9/11, the laws of physics, they didn't stand down on 9/11, and you still don't question your government or even ask for a new investigation, that shows your skepticism of government really isn't all that healthy. Now, in our last 10 minutes or so, Chris, I know you've got other points to make on this issue with NIST's investigation into Building 7 and whether or not it equates to fraud. What can we look forward to in future installments of your series?
The next one is the magical thermal expansion, which will be being posted here, sometime in the next few weeks. And it goes into several different frauds. For starters, they took the temperatures they got from their first program that they put in, the EDS, and they just raised them by 10%, arbitrarily raised them by 10%, and went forward with the damage created by those elevated temperatures. Well, in science, you're not allowed to do that. Yes, it's possible that the fires were 10% hotter than what your computer model projected, but you can't assume that. You have to go with the numbers you've got. So there's the first fraud. Then they took, to get the shear studs on the beams to break, they heated the beam but not the slab. Well, of course you're going to get a temperature differential. The beam is going to expand and the slab isn't, because the beam is being heated and the slab is not. Now, in real world, concrete heats at 85% the rate of steel. So there would not be that much tension on the shear studs, and they would not break. They do not break in real life. There has not been a case. This has never been a problem before. And the only reason they got it to be a problem is by fraudulently heating the beam and not the slab. Then, next thing, they added this 4 hours of heat. It took 4 hours to get the slab and the beams to a certain temperature. They added all that heat in 1.5 seconds. This is also fraudulent. It takes, 4.5 hours to heat something up, or 4 hours to heat something up. You're going to have heat dissipation. And also, that doesn't allow for the beams to sag, which is something else I discovered recently in another discussion with the J-Reffers, is that in order to heat the beams enough to make them expand the 6 inches necessary to push it off the seat, by that time, the beam has already started to sag. And I proposed this in an argument at JREF, and Tony Zambati was also in that argument. And at first he was kind of skeptical, then he went, well, let me check this out. And he went out and he did the math, and he put up a spreadsheet, and he said, Chris, your instincts were right. At 439 degrees Celsius, the loss in length due to sag is greater than the length extension due to heating. So the floor beams could never have pushed the girder more than 4.75 inches, and they needed to push that girder 6 inches, even with lying about the flanges. They actually had to push the girder about 10 or 11 inches, considering the flanges. So the whole thing is a fraud on just so many levels. Those are just some of the things in the next report, the second one on magical thermal expansion.
Well, I'm listening to this, and it makes sense to me. Unfortunately, when you're trying to ask a politician a question and explaining all of this and getting past the smugness to actually get them to visualize what you're describing there, we run into the obstacles, the obvious obstacles. And, we sent out the facts to the police in January, and we have continuing police outreach efforts. What does the average person, in your opinion, do with what you're bringing to the table? I mean, obviously you're proving the case for fraud. We got a crime here committed by a government agency. What can our listeners do to seize control of this investigation and do something about it? Bring it to proper authorities. Who are the proper authorities if the authorities tasked with investigating it by our government are participating in this cover-up?
We are the authorities, and I'm glad you asked that. There's one thing that I've noticed with all the phone calls is the caller, in most cases, goes on too long. You have to get it down to a sound bite. In other words, one sentence or two that makes a statement and a very quick question. It's got to be quick, and it's got to be a question that's very straightforward, like, NIST has confirmed that World Trade Center Building 7 fell at free fall acceleration for 100 feet. And according to the laws of physics, you have to remove all the supporting structure at the same time to get this to happen. Do you understand this principle? Something like that.
Right, and that forces them to answer that. But, it's funny, too, is they'll try to wiggle out of it. And my advice to people is basically very similar to yours. You only get a short moment to get something out before the host hears those buzzwords like Building 7 or NIST or whatever and immediately goes into deflection mode. There's got to be some way to make them address it specifically, even if to say they don't understand. And this is the problem, though, is that a lot of them rely on this so-called authority of NIST and these guys who rattle out some BS like they do in their report, and the politicians who don't want to deal with this issue, who are afraid of it, will just kind of copy and paste NIST's explanation to the people. I mean, are we even going to the right source by talking to politicians, or should we be going more? I mean, is the route of going to more local grassroots like the police and local political authority a better route to go for people?
No, I think we should go everywhere. I think this idea of calling up C-SPAN is really a great idea. Will probably have more impact than going to the police, because remember, police chiefs are political appointees. The sheriffs are the ones who are elected and are more responsible. Now, I talked to my own sheriff, John D'Agostini, here in Placerville, and where he's very big on the Second Amendment, I could not, and I gave him the information on Building 7 and a lot of other stuff. He was non-committal. Okay, I think he's smart enough to know that it's true, but he also knows it's a career ender to come out and say, yes, Building 7 was a controlled demolition, or to question the 9/11. He's got to, keep the respect of everyone, so he cannot do it. So we can just keep asking these politicians and the police and the sheriffs and everyone else, knowing full well that they cannot come out and say, yes, there's a problem here, without losing their jobs. So you have to kind of sympathize with them. But what you can do is we're really talking past them to the audience, to the listening audience. That's really who we're talking to, is Americans, because the government and the press and everything is completely co-opted. It's going to take a massive uprising, like what's going on in Turkey right now, to actually get something to happen. And then there are a lot of politicians, sheriffs, police chiefs, who would like to come out and say, yes, there is a problem here, but they can't until there's a big enough groundswell to do so. But getting back to the questions, it's really critical for everyone in any argument with a so-called skeptic, write out what you're going to say. Get your information into a couple of sentences, make it clean, concise, and then a one-sentence question that they cannot answer. The whole thing is brevity. We live in a soundbite world, so you really have to think sound bites, especially when calling into C-SPAN.
Right, and I think the biggest thing is educating the public, and these people who are holding elected positions need to know that the people have their back, that if they question, they're not going to be voted out, that they're not going to lose their job, that they are supported, and so we need to develop those pockets of people and of support and let them know this really is the mainstream attitude. Even, people are questioning more and more, and so we will let them know that, and we are not going to let this issue die. Chris, we are out of time, but thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall. Folks, remember, you can listen to this show every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.